Good evening, this is the Oscar expert here with Brother Bro, and it's time to talk about Joker, Folie, Deux. Let's just do a general overview of our thoughts on the movie without spoiling, and then let's just dive deeper and longer into spoilers. I don't even know if I liked this movie or not, and I'm gonna work it out. We're gonna work it out together. Yeah, I have to decide if I think it's more good than bad, actually. In the spoiler portion, we're gonna work that out. I came out of this film being like, oof. Ooh, ouchie, youchie, what the hell were they thinking by making this? Like, it's so opposite what everybody expected and what most people wanted from this film. Even I was looking forward to, the point when Joker perhaps breaks out of the prison and then takes on this new identity, holds up the mantle of Joker in some way. Like, these are all of my expectations that are built around an origin story and what the sequel looks like. The film is completely disinterested in all of that. And not just disinterested, but actively feels hostile to fulfilling your expectations in this way, and then seems to chastise you for even wanting that from his first film. It's actually Todd Phillips taking the Joker comic book character and saying, like, you expected me to make a comic book film? The Joker that I created in the first film, he's actually not a comic book character at all. I was making a story about just like a mentally ill fucking loner. So the sequel is going to do justice to that. If you're looking for lore, if you're a fan of Joker because you like DC and comic books, like, it's just not going to work for you. You're not going to get what you came for. If you're looking for Todd Phillips to comment further about Joker as a character and as a human being, and perhaps even on the way that mental illness is portrayed and consumed by an audience, and really just commenting on all of the discourse surrounding the first film, you're gonna get a lot of that. This is a film that is only concerned with its predecessor. It's not trying to build a new story. It's essentially an epilogue for the first film, and it only works if you've seen the first film. Like, this wouldn't even make sense to watch if the first one didn't exist, and if you weren't familiar with the discourse around the first film. It does dive a little deeper into Arthur Fleck versus Joker persona, but it beat that so over the head that it wasn't interesting after maybe the first 35 minutes. The musical sequences I was pretty on board with in the beginning. After a while, it felt like they were only doing them because they had established a prior theme that they need to do the musical sequences. They're illustrating, obviously, like the fantasy that Joker has in his head of what he can be. But that point is hit so much throughout the film that all the musical sequences just kind of reinforce it. They serve the same purpose every single time. Yeah. And I was unfortunately rolling my eyes a little bit when a new musical sequence would start. This film also didn't really work for me as a piece of entertainment. And just being a sort of like movie essay or like reflection on the first film, it doesn't really create an interesting story of its own. And it seems to abandon the audience that elevated the first film in the first place. And I don't really know how to feel about that. I think I'm gonna hash my thoughts out about that in the spoiler portion. I was confused for most of the film about why it was existing, and then only after thinking about it further did it make sense to me why the film was actually made. And I ultimately respect what Todd Phillips is doing because he's so dedicated to the substance of Arthur, and it's clear what he thinks that character is by the end of this film. Someone brought up like Dune Part 2 as a comparison. Like, you leave Dune Part 2, many people understand that Paul Atreides is not the hero of the story, but nonetheless, it tends to be lost on people. And then Frank Herbert made Dune Messiah as a response to the way people saw that and like cleared up the record for them, right? That's what this film essentially is like clearing up the record. So now we should just get into spoilers. A thought I had leaving the theater was, did Todd Phillips just apologize for making Joker? Him killing Joker at the end of this movie, you can read it as him thinking that he, by creating this character, kind of let the cat out of the bag, emboldened a bunch of people who thought, yeah, go Joker, fuck society. He kind of wanted to kill that off, and he's very anti-people who are thinking this way. It reminded me of Fight Club. I mean, the first one kind of reminds you of Fight Club too, but this one, the Tyler Durden is the Joker, and Arthur Fleck is, Ed Norton. And in the end of the film, Tyler Durden's not real, and he's basically created this monster that he can't control. And like with Fight Club, some people are very swept up in the Tyler Durden character, and they think that that's cool to be so like anti-establishment, and they agree with his grievances. But the film, if you really read it correctly, is critical of people who use those grievances with the world to like enact violence or whatever. The first film didn't make it obvious that Arthur Fleck was not somebody to be revered, and it makes you empathize with his grievances to the point where you can put yourself in his shoes and say, yeah, you know, society did treat him really bad, and maybe to some extent society is responsible. We can see how someone would get to that place. The fact that many people did not take away that from the first film, maybe it does speak to a weakness in the film's commentary on its subject matter, which is mental health. Like, the fact that you can watch Joker #1 and come away with a somewhat glamorized portrait of what his mental illness really is, and have it be anything other than like, this guy's just fucked up and like very mentally ill, and mental illness is not something to be glorified, like that speaks to a weakness in the first film, and the second film is like cleaning up that mess. But like, you kind of did create the mess in the first place.
So I think the first film is rightly disgruntled with the world and doesn't know what to do with it, but makes the observation that when people are met with worlds that are beyond their control, when they're kind of at the bottom of the pile, that they enact violence. Like, it simply is an observation that happens.
And I think it's fair, just for art's sake, that you can make a film that doesn't explicitly tell the audience, hey, don't think this. So I think Joker 1 still works. I do think every movie is responsible to some extent for the audience's perception of it, and if a lot of people took away that Joker was a badass from the first film, that's not fantastic, and maybe there is some culpability.
I actually think one of the strong aspects of the first Joker film is that Joaquin Phoenix does not play the character like a badass, and at times he seems very pathetic and cringeworthy, and I like that about Joaquin Phoenix's performance here.
Yeah.
And in this film, he almost seems more pathetic. And I agree that you can't necessarily place it on the film to tell the audience whether or not they should root for this person, although that was a reason that people were upset with it. Some people thought this movie's being irresponsible because it doesn't make it very clear that you should not sympathize with the Joker. But I think that Todd Phillips should probably look at that reception, stand on his 2 feet, and said, hey, I made a movie that people are debating. Like, fuck it. That's what I did. But this movie, you can almost think of it as overly apologetic. I wonder if he thought too much about the discourse. Was there really a need to try to reinforce that he doesn't like the people who are emboldened by the Joker? It's a message against them that this is just a fantasy that you're indulging in. You'll never be accepted for yourself if you indulge in this fantasy. Because Arthur Fleck will never be accepted as Arthur Fleck, which is the tragedy of this film.
I do like how the film is commenting on delusion and ego, because Arthur uses this persona of Joker as a shield for his own trauma and pain, and that's where you get these excuses where he's pointing outward and saying, society did this to me. And I think Todd Phillips is just saying, you know, you as an audience and as a viewer are not allowed to use that as an excuse. When you take your own pain and you point it outward at the world, it's only about you, and you're creating a fantasy for yourself that makes you cope with your own mental illness, and we should not be glorifying your mental illness. Your pain is not something meant to be like worshipped in that fashion, like creating a superhero out of it.
Yeah, but he did also give us a portrait of a world that is neglectful of these people. And even in this film, the guards do horrific acts to him. When like the little person comes in to testify, he's laughed at. So he continues to paint a portrait of a world where a lot of people are left behind and mistreated. He doesn't offer any like way out for people.
Well, here's the thing. I think he would say the way out is not by creating upheaval in society. Like, the worst thing the Joker could have done was believe himself to be this prophet and then like cause more chaos. Actually, Arthur Fleck is the real hero here, right? Because he takes ownership over the fact that Joker is a delusion. He chooses to live in reality. He chooses to acknowledge just the horror of his situation. And that is perhaps the best that, as on an individual level, that Arthur Fleck could have done. And in the film, he's not rewarded for it. There's no reward. And again, maybe that's looking back at society and saying, like, this is sort of fucked up, because we can't even see how he is the hero here. Like, we don't get to celebrate him because society doesn't celebrate that sort of thing. It's not grandiose. It's also not entertaining, and it's not sexy. And I liked the ending. That kind of like snapped me awake, because the act of this other mentally ill man killing Arthur has just the same meaning as Arthur killing the talk show host and all the other folks. It's senseless.
Yeah, but in the first film, it's like, oh, the talk show is like the elites and the people on the subway. They're rich Wall Street elites.
Well, maybe you weren't supposed to read it that way.
But it was that way.
Cinema is supposed to be a place where we can watch violence happen, and we can feel catharsis from that violence without it actually having real world implications. Like, it's kind of a place that people go to in order to experience those fantasies. And I think those fantasies are safe. It's like playing a video game. Like, it's safe to transport yourself into a video game and like shoot up a bunch of people, or like play Grand Theft Auto and like crash your car. You know, maybe it is a little unfair to the fans of the first film that they appreciated that fantasy and were then told that they shouldn't be allowed to have it. But I do agree that the important thing here is when that's you, when you're the person who's saying, yeah, it would be righteous to get revenge on this or this person because this thing happened to me. You know, you still have a responsibility to own your own pain. And but maybe that's what Phillips would encourage those people to do.
See, this is where I think the movie doesn't work well enough, is that Arthur Fleck's decision to be Arthur Fleck felt like it came out of nowhere. I didn't know what was in it for Arthur Fleck to thrive in the world. I didn't know what would feel good for him to drop the Joker persona at that point.
I think it's actually
should have offered him more. And the film itself doesn't offer the audience who may have felt like, yeah, fuck yeah, we like the Joker. It doesn't offer them anything else to believe in or hope in. Like, it doesn't even...
Kind of just makes them upset, doesn't it?
If they're supposed to believe in themselves and reflect inward, like, what do they get out of it? It doesn't offer much.
It is a little messy in that way.
It's very bleak.
It's very provocative in that it doesn't provide answers. I mean, that's like classic for if you're going to be a provocative film, not to tell people exactly what you're going for. Even though he hears these truths he doesn't want to hear from the lawyer, I think he realizes that she was right and sees that Lee was deceptive. And that brings him fully around to the lawyer's perspective. Like, yeah, she's right the whole time. She's right that Arthur is doing these things out of being just fucking mentally ill. And she's also right that Harley doesn't have his best interests in mind.
Well, I guess because Harley and Joker's fans are just using this character that he created to embolden themselves, but they don't really care about who he is.
They just care about him as a symbol, and when he's not that symbol, when he chooses to deviate from it, like, they're not going to be there to support him. And really, you know, they're not going to support his mental illness. Like, it's not going to be helped by becoming this martyr, right? The only thing that could help Arthur is if he actually got to go to a treatment facility, right?
Yeah, but that's not even on nothing's on the horizon for him.
Yeah, I know, and he dies because there's nowhere for him to go. And maybe that's where, like the first film, people did take this away from the first film, to be fair, saying that, you know, the resource for mentally ill people, just for that to exist, is at least something to strive for.
Arthur Fleck deciding, you know what? I'm just going to go to prison and be miserable until my sentence is up. It happened after he saw his friend get killed by the guards, and he thought, I'm causing something that is more ugly than it's worth. But again, that was an instance where, like, the authorities, you know, when you're watching the movie, you're like, man, I really hope that these cops get what's coming to them in some way. And the movie's kind of just tells you to be a puppy and put your tail back between your legs and look inward. And it's weird because, again, it does offer that terrible portrait of the world, and then it kind of tells you that to do nothing about it.
Well, I don't think it needs a call to action. It just needs to present a world that feels real, and it is realistic, right? Like, if somebody did something horrible and went to prison, and the real root of the cause was a mental illness that could potentially be treated, there's nowhere for that person to go. That person's in prison. It's going to make their mental illness worse. Prison is not about reform. It's about being vindictive and punishing, even though they call it like correctional facilities. Like, they're not effective at correcting behavior.
See, I do kind of respect the movie right now because studios, and especially with comic book films, are so unwilling to take risks and to actually challenge audiences and to not do fan service. I almost like that this movie forces fans to grapple with it, but I also think it gives them so little that it will not really be a productive conversation for them. But maybe nothing would be. Now that I'm thinking about what the movie is saying and what its themes are, I am imagining that it could have been still in a more entertaining film that allows itself to indulge a little bit in that fantasy of the Joker in the way that, like, you know, The Wolf of Wall Street, Fight Club, even Joker 1. Those films are not endorsing their main characters, but they let the audience go on a thrill ride with them.
I think Todd Phillips identifies the inherent problem in doing that. And that's why he avoids any sensationalism.
What is the inherent problem?
All of those films, they result in the same cohort of people watching them and feeling emboldened or feeling seen. And he's like, I'm not seeing you. And I think he recognizes that there's an inherent problem, that, like, there's no way to do it without servicing those people. Does he
think that he wasn't successful with the first film and getting his message across?
Well, I think that the second is clearly a correction of that. I mean, the fact that it avoids violence, except for like one fantasy sequence that doesn't even really...
The only violence that happens is that Joker dies in the end of the movie, really. But then he shouldn't have made the first movie if he thinks that a movie should never do that. Then it's an apology for the first film. This is interesting. I don't think he should apologize for the first film. You can make art
that divides people and their perspectives. That's just what stories are going to do. And you can't control for how your audience reads a film, especially if the audience doesn't engage that deeply with it and just uses it as a sort of costume or like makes it part of their identity when you didn't intend to. You cannot control for that, but it's going to happen when you make an appealing piece of entertainment, especially when it comes to something like a revenge film, which Joker 1 sort of is. I don't think he should apologize for it, even though I feel like he is doing some apologetics, but what I think he's more doing is taking the full weight of what he created and of films like that and of just entertainment in general and responding to that. It's very effective if you actually break it down at doing exactly that.
So what you're saying is, this is his The Irishman.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, yeah.
So he's
that makes
still
sense.
going with Scorsese.
Because The Irishman starts to take its characters very seriously, right? There's a very sobering third act where they just look at themselves in the mirror and they're like, I feel bad about myself. I don't like myself. I don't like what I did. And then Joker, it's like getting really sober about who Arthur is. Get rid of all the fantasy, get rid of his delusion, get rid of his ego, and he's just a hurt person who beneath it all is traumatized and has been deeply abused. And he's not a hero, he's not a martyr, and he doesn't deserve a place on any kind of pedestal. The funny thing is that the film isn't trying to do anything else. It's so caught up in the first story that it doesn't really create a good or memorable story of its own and works only as a piece of commentary about the first film and its reaction and its audience. It doesn't make for a good story. Like, this is not a memorable story. It's just a good piece to think about. You know, it just gives you a lot of food for thought. But I also feel like inherently opposed to the fact that so many people are not getting what they expect. It almost feels unfair. There is some kind of limit to me where you could be coming up with the most insightful commentary, but if you package it in this way where you draw in like all these fans of like your first film and then give them something completely different, essentially a bait and switch, I don't know if I feel that can be justified. Because most people are just going to have a negative experience with the film and feel like they wasted their money and time on it. But at the same time, me as someone who like independent film and do not care about superhero movie, I had fun with the subversion. I'm mostly surprised in a good way. I can't recommend the film necessarily, but I think it was good because it provoked a whole conversation about it.
But I also think it could have provoked a more interesting conversation if it was a more fleshed out movie overall, which is also true of the first film. It provoked a lot of conversation, but I feel like really, you can't dig all that deep into it. To summarize, I think this film is best looked at as a deconstruction of the first Joker and kind of looking up to comic book characters, reviewing anybody as being more than just a human being. I like that it tries to be sobering, but I also think it is overly sensitive to criticisms of the first that it probably shouldn't even feel the need to respond to. So I don't know, I'm very down the middle on it. I don't even know if I liked it or not. I just think it's interesting, kinda.
I didn't like it. When I watched it, I was like, this isn't good. I don't like this. But in the rearview mirror, I'm like, that was interesting. I'm gonna give it a 7 though.
Really?
Yeah.
You didn't even like it when you left.
Yeah, I know.
I'll give it like a 6. I'm between a 5 and a 6, but we'll go positive because I'd prefer this to a movie that leaves me with absolutely nothing.
Todd Phillips, though, just being willing to risk it all. No studio is going to ask him to do a franchise film ever again, and he's like, yeah, don't even call me about it. I
still don't know how I feel about him as a filmmaker because I feel like his films end up interesting by half accident. And even this movie, the musical stuff and the constant going back and forth, the Arthur or Joker is hitting it very over the head.
Yeah, it kind of, I didn't really talk about it, but I was kind of nauseated.
I think if Todd Phillips was a better filmmaker, the conversation around his film would be a little more substantive rather than debating like whether or not the movie succeeded. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing.
Do you think this experiment paid off?